Is democracy that weak? Is democracy something which is so filled with all kinds of difficulties and self contradictions that it can't be relied upon? Is there any way, is there any direction that we can take that will help us deal with the crises that we experience in our times? This is what brings us to a consideration of Lincoln.
I've listened to Dr. Alan Guelzo for many years, countless hours through the great courses. And if he were to be behind me in a supermarket line and begin to talk, I would know it's him before I turned around. And if I had to describe him for people who may not know him, it would be his affinity for details and his understanding of nuance. We all know that the devil's in the details, and he's clearly spent his entire life studying history because he knows that history is in the details. His skill for understanding nuance is keenly paired with the gift to articulate his discoveries through like a storytelling craftsmanship. It's an art, it's a flair that really makes him available to the everyday man. And that's why when there's commentary to be made or insight to consider, people turn to Alan Guelzo. And you might say, like who? One would be the teaching company known as the Great Courses, the History Channel. I, for one, have watched the documentary and seen him pop up. Someone has him give an insight on something. C-SPAN, CNN, the Daily Show's even had him. Universities all over America will go to him, and even our very own White House. So it should be no surprise that the Philadelphia GAR Museum would look to him as well. And it's not just because he's a Philadelphia Phillies fan. So if there's anything you'd like to add to that, and I'll hand it over to you, and look forward to the presentation.
All right. Well, after an introduction like that, I almost wonder if I shouldn't stop right now, because how can I possibly do better than that? I think I'll only go downhill from that point. I'll only add it's not just the Phillies who are a subject of interest, but the old Philadelphia Athletics. The 1929 Philadelphia A's are the team that I will insist was the greatest team in baseball history. And I've even talked at some length about the history of the Athletics in the heyday of Connie Mack and Shibe Park, because for one thing, my grandfather lived up in that neighborhood. So I have a few interests beyond those of the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln, and that's one of them. On the other hand, I have probably spent more time camped out on the subject of the Civil War and Lincoln than almost any other subject, baseball included, even at the times, well, in one's youth, so to speak, when baseball threatens to blot out interest in any other possible subject. Now, I've been interested in the Civil War for a very long time. I think really since I was a small boy and pestered my mother into buying me a comic book version of The Red Badge of Courage. In the appendix to that comic book, there was a 16-page history of the Civil War. How you got the whole Civil War into 16 pages was something of a miracle, but there it was, and you might say that was my primer to the history of the Civil War. It was pestering my grandmother for a comic book, another one, of Abraham Lincoln, that began my connection with the 16th president. So it's a subject, or a pair of subjects, which have been at the forefront of my attention for a very long time.
I wanted to talk to you about Lincoln particularly today, because we have been through a time of what you might call great crisis, a great anxiety in American political life. I think for a lot of us, it may be the most stressful time that we can remember, when there has been more polarization, more difficulty, more argument, more accusation of the most extraordinary sort, back and forth across a variety of political aisles. There was a time, not too recently, but there was a time when it seemed like democracy was a fairly straightforward affair. In 1989, we saw the Berlin Wall come down, a great triumph for democracy. 2 years later, the Soviet Union, the largest scale example of totalitarianism, collapsed in on itself. Once again, it appeared that democracy was the one player, politically speaking, left standing, and that we had arrived at a point that one political scientist called the end of history. There was simply no other alternatives to democracy. But in the decades since, we've had some chastening. We have seen the resurgence of an authoritarian regime in Russia. We have seen the movement to economic dominance in the world by a totalitarian government in China. We have seen democracy assailed and subverted in a variety of places, to the point where in April of 2024, when FreedomWorks, which measures the health of democracies around the world, issued its annual report, it found that democracy had actually been on the wane in many places, that perhaps only 20 nations on the face of the earth could actually call themselves democratic and free in any practical environment. And at that moment, we look at democracy and we wonder, is democracy that weak? Is democracy something which is so filled with all kinds of difficulties and self-contradictions that it can't be relied upon? Is there any way, is there any direction that we can take that will help us deal with the crises that we experience in our times? This is what brings us to a consideration of Lincoln. Because Abraham Lincoln, of course, had to deal with a stupendous crisis in the history of the American democracy, the greatest crisis, in fact, that we have ever experienced, politically speaking. It was a crisis which involved the breaking up of the American nation, or at least the attempt at breaking it up. It involved us in a civil war with horrendous consequences and casualties, both literal and economic. And yet, somehow at the end of it, Lincoln is the person who steers the ship of state to a successful conclusion. Not only keeps the ship of state upright, that was an accomplishment in its own terms, but actually brings it to a harbor of reunification and a future that made the United States the single most important player in terms of promoting and defending democracy in the history of the modern world. And if Lincoln could do that, is there anything then that we can learn from Lincoln? Is there direction that we can take from the 16th president that would be applicable to our situation today? I think that if we look to Lincoln, what we discover is something of a surprise. Surprise in the sense that Lincoln actually uses the term democracy only 137 times in the 8 volumes of his collected writings. So if you comb through them, democracy is not a word he spends a lot of time explaining because, for one thing, he didn't really feel he needed to. He felt that people would understand what he was talking about. And so he only actually offers a definition of the term democracy on one occasion. And that's in 1858, as he is standing on the verge of beginning his great campaign against Stephen A. Douglas for the senior U.S. Senate seat from Illinois. And at that moment, he offers a definition of democracy, which in some respects will strike us as a little strange because it's actually a negative definition. He says at that point, as I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. This expresses my idea of democracy. Whatever differs from this, to the extent of the difference, is no democracy. It's a definition worth pondering. Pondering, first of all, because you do need to sort out the fact that it is cast in the negative. He does not say what democracy is so much as what he says it isn't. But contained within that definition is one very obvious positive point, and that is democracy is about consent. What he is saying is, if you don't want to be a slave, and the presumption is from his hearers and from all of us that we do not want to be a slave, if you don't want to be a slave, don't be a master. If you don't want to be dominated, controlled, and oppressed by others, don't be domineering, controlling, and oppressive yourself. Because essentially what democracy is about consent. It's people consent. They consent to be governed. They consent to be directed. They ask you for an opinion and then they act on it. Democracy is very much about consent. And in the great speech he gave in Peoria, Illinois, in October of 1854, just after the passage of the infamous Kansas-Nebraska Act, and really at the very beginning of his re-entry into political life, a re-entry which would take him all the way to the presidency in 6 years. In that great Peoria speech, Lincoln says that consent is the sheet anchor of American republicanism. He goes to the Declaration of Independence. He takes apart its terms. He isolates its key elements. And for him, he points to what Thomas Jefferson says in the Declaration about government being a matter of the consent of the governed. And for Lincoln, that, he says, that is the sheet anchor of this American experiment. That is what we are about, the consent of people. And consent is what's wrapped up in that definition of democracy. So for him, you start off, the bedrock of the entire notion of democracy is that democracy is a system in which people consent to be governed. They consent with the ideas, they consent to the rules, they consent to the procedures that are created to form a government for themselves. It's not imposed on them. It's not a matter of hierarchy. It's not a matter of a king or an emperor who has been born to that title and believes that he can ride his subjects, booted and spurred as though they were made to be ridden that way. No, unlike those systems, consent is the key to what Americans understand to be their democracy about. So we begin with this fundamental idea. Democracy is about consent. Anything which does not have consent involved in it, which involves imposition, which involves force, which involves compulsion without people having any means of input or say or comment about it, that is, Lincoln says, no democracy. Okay, so we begin there. From that, Lincoln takes us to four major aspects of democratic life, which, as far as he is concerned, are really the building blocks. If consent is the foundation, then the construction of a democracy on that foundation has to include four materials. One of those materials is about sovereignty, which is a fancy way of saying, who's the boss? In a democracy, who is sovereign? Well, we know who is sovereign in a monarchy, and that is the king. That's why we call a king a sovereign. Because in a monarchy, authority to rule is supposed to be bestowed by God, or at least by nature, on a single individual, on a king, on a monarch. And then that person distributes and uses his authority to rule others. So it's a top-down procedure. That's what sovereignty means in a monarchy. But in a democracy, sovereignty runs exactly the opposite way. Democracy moves from the people upwards. No one who is in position of government, a government officer, even the military, none of those possess an authority of their own independent from the people. Because in a democracy, the people themselves possess the sovereignty. Now, for their own convenience, they may delegate that sovereignty to others. They may delegate it to representatives whom they elect to a legislature, and the legislature itself then passes laws. Or they may delegate that sovereignty to an executive functionary, such as, in the American environment, a president. But it's always a delegation. The people never give away their sovereignty. They merely say that for our convenience, because we've got other things to do, like making a living, because we have other things to do, we will delegate some of this sovereignty to these other officials and representatives. But it is a delegation. Sovereignty belongs to the people. And Lincoln made this very clear in his very first inaugural, when he said that in a democratic order like the American Republic, sovereignty belongs, control belongs to the people who inhabit the country. There's no class, no separate class of nobility, of rulers, of authorities. One aspect of our Constitution, which I think people do not pay nearly enough attention to, which we take so very much for granted, is tucked into the closing articles of the Constitution. It provides that there shall be no titles of nobility in American life. Now, we think today, oh yeah, sure, of course, no titles of nobility, no duke this, no lord of that. But reflect on it for a moment. By putting that into the Constitution, we excluded the entire idea that there would be a class of people who possessed some kind of intrinsic authority to boss other people around. In a democracy, the people are the boss. The people are the sovereign. And they only delegate from time to time and for their convenience that sovereignty, that authority, to some others. And what's more, if they don't like what those others are doing, they can take it back. Which brought Lincoln to the second aspect of what democratic life was supposed to be like, and that was elections. Lincoln loved elections. Lincoln had been part of elections from his early adulthood, running for office, in this case, the Illinois State Legislature, as early as 1832. And almost his entire life can be defined by participating in elections, either as a candidate, which he was frequently, or else as someone who was organizing elections. It's interesting to watch in Lincoln's papers, especially in his earlier political career, how much attention the man paid to the details of organizing people for elections, of setting up precinct captains, of making sure that people were getting the vote out for the particular party that he was aligned with, which in his early career was the Whig Party. Lincoln paid enormous amounts of attention to that because he considered that elections were vitally important. And not just elections per se, but elections that were frequent, that were fair, that were open, but especially elections that were frequent. Because for him, the purpose that is served above all others by elections is the purpose of accountability. If in a democratic regime, what you do is you delegate some control, some authority, some aspect of your sovereignty to others, you don't give it away permanently. There's always a measure of accountability. There's always a measure when those people who fill offices or who serve as representatives, there's always a moment when they have to come back to the people and say, this is what we did. And the people either say, yes, that was a good job. Let's give it to you again to do. Or else they say, you botched it, you blew it, and you're going to have to find some other line of work because we're putting someone else in that office. That's really what elections are about. Elections are about accountability. It's easy to lose sight of that because of so much ballyhoo that goes on, and not to mention so much money that gets flushed into them these days. But in truth, the fundamental purpose served by elections is accountability. And apart from that, Lincoln said, how can we have free government? If you don't have elections, you don't really have a democracy. So the idea that somehow, as it's often said, you can have one man, one vote, one time, that's what happens. That's what happens in cheap dictatorships. That's a phony imitation of democracy. Democracies are about the constant turnover of elections. Some people will say, well, that creates a lot of instability. Yes, and that's one of the risks that you run in a democracy. But the risk of too much stability, where one person is in charge and stays in charge, that's an even greater risk to run. Lincoln might have, in 1864, for instance, have had what we could perhaps construe as very good reason for canceling the presidential election of that year. I mean, for one thing, in 1864, the United States was in the middle of a civil war, a catastrophic civil war. Talk about disruption. Would anyone who was looking at this from afar have blamed Lincoln terribly much if he said, look, there's so much confusion going on. There's so much contest. There's so much ill will. This is so great an emergency that we're going to postpone the national presidential election until the war is over. That might, in some hands and from some people, have sounded like a perfectly logical thing to do. And of course, he had an even more personal reason for wanting to do something like that, because the election that was going to take place in the fall of 1864 was going to come at a time when Union military fortunes were not exactly at their brightest. Remember what was happening in 1864. You had Ulysses Grant and the Army of the Potomac in the Great Overland Campaign, and what had happened to that Overland Campaign? The Wilderness, Spotsylvania, North Anna River, Cold Harbor, and then the Siege of Petersburg. It looked to people in the fall of 1864 as though the last card in the Union hands had been played and failed. And Lincoln had really good reason to wonder if, in fact, he was not going to get punished, and punished badly at the polls. And then he had to cope with the fact that the opposite party had nominated one of his great rivals, General George McClellan. And McClellan was a man with substantial popular appeal. If Lincoln, for either personal or for long-term policy reasons, had suggested the idea of postponing the election, could people have terribly much blamed him? Oh, they might have denounced him. But when you look at it as objectively as you can, there would have been at least some reason for not plunging a country that was already tortured by this long drawn-out civil war into a yet more serious confrontation, politically speaking, in a national election. And yet, he does not do that. He steams right into the election, even though at the end of August of 1864, he tells his cabinet that he really does not expect he's going to be reelected. And he makes them sign a blind memorandum to that effect. Well, of course, we know what happened. We know that the Union's military fortunes, especially in the Shenandoah Valley, especially at Atlanta, especially at Mobile Bay, Union military fortunes turned around in a dramatic way, and it gave him exactly the kind of momentum he needed to steam towards reelection. But when a crowd of well-wishers came to the White House after his reelection in November of 1864, that was when he reflected on what might have happened if the election had been canceled. And he said very candidly, we could not cancel the election. Dire as the situation seemed to be, you could not have free government without elections, even in the midst of a crisis of those proportions. If we had canceled or postponed the election, Lincoln said, then the Confederacy could quite legitimately have claimed to have won, have claimed that, see, the federal government, the United States government, really is built on straw, that it has no real substance and no real continuity. And Lincoln said at that moment, we would have lost the war in the most fundamental terms. We would have lost the war because we would have given up on democracy. And what was the war about in the longest sense, except the preservation of that democracy? What was the war about, Lincoln said at Gettysburg in November of 1863, except undergoing a test of whether this nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure? Sovereignty and elections were two important building blocks of democracy. But there was a third, and the third concerned the result of sovereignty and elections, and that is the balance between majorities and minorities. In a democracy, The one thing you can be fairly sure you're not going to encounter is absolute 100% agreement by all participants. Even the original model of democracy in ancient Athens, even though the Athenian democracy involved probably no more than about 6,000 participants in the city assembly, nevertheless, even there, you did not get complete unanimity. And Lincoln, in his 1861 first inaugural, said quite frankly, complete unanimity is not to be looked for in any kind of democratic regime where there are real legitimate elections. So we don't expect unanimity. We don't expect a unanimous vote. That means that the direction of policy gets determined by the majority of who votes. And the majority is the instrument by which a democracy moves forward, making decisions and putting those decisions into play. Now, of course, that means there's always going to be a minority. In every election, there's going to be winners. In every election, there are going to be losers. But a majority in a democracy does not thereupon say, since we won, since we are the majority, we will now stamp the minority out of existence. A majority is not licensed in a democracy to take a minority and stand them up against a barn wall and shoot them. Now, by the same token, because a majority has the legitimate right to set policy, a minority does not have the right to subvert the majority. The minority has the right to speak, and it has that right to speak because within democracies, there is a certain degree of what we could call humility. Democratic humility says we grant to majorities the right to rule, but we don't automatically assume that just because they're a majority, they're always right. And by the same token, we say to minorities that no, they cannot set policy, but that doesn't mean that it might not turn out that that minority was right on certain important questions. And it's because we always have a certain measure of healthy self-doubt within a democracy, that majorities do not suppress minorities because the minority might turn out one day to be right. The minority might persuade people, and the minority might become the new majority. And likewise, by the same token, the majority does not erase a minority, because the majority might have second thoughts and say, you know, the minority had a point. The minority might have been correct about a certain apprehension. The minority might contain voices that we need to listen to. And so while the minority may not subvert, by the same token, the majority may not abolish the minority. And therefore, there is this back and forth between majorities and minorities within a democracy. And that has to be respected. And Lincoln insisted that that has to be the case because there is a constant movement between the two, between majorities that sometimes turn out to be wrong and minorities that sometimes turn out to be right. This is why questions have to be settled, not by violence, not by force, but in a democracy by the ballot box. It is not bullets, Lincoln said, not bullets, but ballots that matter in a democracy. But how do you make sure, and this brings me to the fourth thing that Lincoln talked about as a building block of democracy, how do you make sure that majorities and minorities respect each other? How do you make sure that majorities and minorities do not reach first for the bullets? And that fourth thing then for Lincoln is law. Law is what exercises restraint, healthy restraint in a democracy. And it also means that respect for law has to be paramount in a democracy. In a sense, law describes how reason operates in a democracy. And for Lincoln, that was extremely important. Lincoln is very much a man of the Enlightenment, just as Jefferson and Franklin and Washington were. Very much a man who respected reason. In an early speech that he gave in 1842, he spoke of how reason should control us. Hail, fall of fury, he said. Hail, rule of reason. And over again in his speeches, he encourages people to pursue the rule of reason as opposed to yielding to impulse, yielding to what he called passion. For Lincoln, passion was a suspect concept. It might, in fact, be said to be one of the bad words in his political dictionary, because he understood passion as being something that carried people away, that took them down dark corridors and gave them permission to do unspeakable things. Passion was when people stopped thinking and let impulse rule them, in the worst sense of the word, impulse. But that being the case, what captures the operation of reason in a democracy more than law? Law is how we sort out in public the proper procedures for how we identify what we should do and what we shouldn't do, how what we should do should be rewarded, how what we shouldn't do should be punished. And it is because the rule of law was so important to him that in the first great public speech that he gave in 1838, he spoke of how respect for law should become what he called the political religion of the American nation. It should be something, he said, that every mother taught to the infant that prattles on her lap, that it should be taught in schools and in seminaries and in colleges, that it should be the thing that we guided ourselves at every point with. Now, one could raise the question at this point, where does that leave room for civil disobedience? Well, for Lincoln, it has to be said, it doesn't really leave very much, if any, room at all. For him, living as he did west of the Appalachians, living as he did on the frontier, where violence and misbehavior could be all too common and all too unrestrained, what Lincoln had to witness growing up were frequent outbursts of the worst kinds of passion. How do you restrain that in a democracy? You restrain it by law, by reverence for law. And for him, the word reverence and the word law were just so inextricably bound up with each other that you couldn't disentangle them. That didn't mean, as he understood, that there were not laws that were wrong, unfair. But the solution to those laws, like the solution to elections and majorities, was to proceed through the ballot box, through reason. Change the laws, don't break them. Because the moment you set your path on the breakage of law, then that is the moment when, in fact, democracy begins to evaporate. You may think that it's a good thing sometimes that you will preserve democracy if you step outside the law, that the law becomes a burden to democracy. Lincoln rebuked that way of thinking. Now, that did not mean that having laid that foundation with consent and having used these building blocks to construct an idea of democracy, I have to admit it does not mean that Lincoln was always perfect in his own observance of them. Take this matter of law, for instance. When he becomes president, he finds deposited on his desk at the very beginning this momentous issue, as he said, of civil war. And along with civil war, of some very large-scale movements of anti-war dissent. And probably the most famous example of them concerns the Ohio congressman, Clement Vallandigham, who in 1863, after giving an incendiary speech in the town circle of Mount Vernon, Ohio, is arrested by military authority and tried by a military tribunal, not by a civil court, found guilty of treason, and is sentenced to be imprisoned at Fort Warren in Boston Harbor. There is an outcry over the Vallandigham imprisonment. It is done by the military, not by civil law enforcement. It is done before a military tribunal, not by a civil court. There are no standing rules of evidence. There is no due process. And this man, Vallandigham, is then going to spend an unspecified amount of time in prison. And Lincoln is willing to defend this. He's willing to defend it because, as I say, it created quite an outcry. And in response to that outcry, he issues a public letter defending the Vallandigham arrest and imprisonment. And he defends it on this ground. Is the way Vallandigham was treated constitutional? And he concedes, no, not entirely. But he then goes on to argue, what happened with Vallandigham happened because we're in the middle of a national emergency called the Civil War. And in an environment of national emergency, the Constitution does not operate the same way that it does in times of peace. This was a surprising argument for Lincoln, and he resorted to what you might call an emotional argument of the sort you might use in front of a jury to persuade them. He said, must I shoot the simple soldier boy who deserts and not touch a hair on the head of the wily agitator who induces him to desert, which is what he believed Vallandigham was doing in his anti-war dissent? And the answer of emotion to that question is, no, you must not shoot the soldier boy. Yes, you must touch more than a hair on the head of the wily agitator. But the constitutional answer to that question is exactly the opposite. Yes, you must shoot the soldier boy who deserts, and no, you may not touch the hairs on the head of the wily agitator or any other agitator who is operating under the terms of the First Amendment. That kind of failure on Lincoln's part is something that those of us who spend a lot of time with Lincoln and admire Lincoln often try to disguise. I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think it's a good idea because, first of all, not even Abraham Lincoln is perfect. As I often say to people, Lincoln did not walk on the Potomac. And there were moments when he was less than his own principles. And that was one of them. The good thing is that it was, in fact, only a moment. Take Lincoln as a whole, and you find that Lincoln himself understood the importance of respecting the constitutional restraints. When his over-righteous Treasury Secretary, Salmon Chase, urged him in September of 1863 to move ahead and apply the Emancipation Proclamation broadly across the country without respect to the 4 states that stayed in the Union and nevertheless still legalized slavery, the so-called border states, Lincoln responded, I can't do that unilaterally. I can't make the Emancipation Proclamation apply in those states. If I did that, he said, would I not be outside the Constitution and law? Would I not be in the boundless field of absolutism? And so he refused. Not because he didn't want to see emancipation go forward, but because Lincoln understood the importance of law as a restraint even on himself. When we reflect on Abraham Lincoln, what we see is a great man who articulates great principles about democracy. He does not always, and in every respect, have the opportunity to give personal example of them, and sometimes he makes mistakes. Well, what else, when you say that, what else are you saying except that practice, as it does for all of human history, frequently lags behind principle? It is when we look at how Lincoln, in time after time, applied those principles of democracy to elections, to sovereignty, to law. That's when we really become impressed with the example Lincoln sets for us. And what's more, he sets out what I think are some particular qualities in democratic leaders that are important to the survival of democracy. I think in this respect that Lincoln shows us the importance of resilience, of being able to absorb punishment, which he does in tremendous quantities. Lincoln also talks in terms of humility. He does not see himself as the grand leader. If anything, said one observer, Lincoln always talked in a manner that made you think that he thought of himself more as the attorney general of the people rather than even as a president. Not only humility, not only humor, not only resilience, but ultimately submission to law itself. These are personal characteristics of Lincoln, and they stand in contrast with the characteristics we often associate with anti-democratic forms of leadership. Anti-democratic forms of leadership, like the leadership of authoritarians, is always built upon honor, how you appear, how you impress people. It's based upon force. It's based upon the submission of people. There's nothing of that in Lincoln. Government by bureaucracy, which is always about competence, about rules. There's nothing of that in Lincoln either. Lincoln was not what today we would call a populist, but at the same time, he was not an elitist either. So when we turn to the example that Lincoln sets for us, we see vital principles that lay it out for our democracy, and we also see a particular example. An example that I think shines at its brightest at the very end of his life in the second inaugural, when he talks about malice toward none and charity for all. He's talking about something that he believed was toxic to a democracy, and that is the passion for vengeance. On the 4th of March, 1865, when he delivered his second inaugural, the war was winding down to its final weeks. He might have been expected at that point to deliver the rhetorical equivalent of a victory lap. He could have promised the destruction of the old Southern way of life completely. He could have promised to pursue and to punish as treasonous, as traitors, the people who had led the Southern Rebellion. And he does not do that. He does not do that because even after the loss of somewhere close to 700,000 lives, the destruction of billions, literally billions of dollars of property, at the end of that, he is still wanting to say to people, malice toward none, charity for all. Retribution is one of those qualities which has no place in a democracy. Tit for tat, punishment for political wrongs or imaginary grievances, these are things that democracies can be swamped by. And he saw the possibility that a victorious union, willing to indulge in the worst possible examples, retribution, was something that in fact would kill off the democracy they had spent 4 years trying to preserve. All of these are aspects of Lincoln and Lincoln's idea of democracy, which offer us the qualities of democracy itself as things to incorporate into the life of our own politics, even today. They show us how and what we need to sustain in our democratic life as a country. If we want to see an example of how to conduct ourselves and conduct our public life today, then I think that we could really, in looking through the whole of American history, find no better model, imperfect as it sometimes was, than that of Abraham Lincoln. And a model, I would hasten to add, not just for our leadership, not just for the democratic experiment as a whole, but for ourselves as well, as citizens of a democracy. Well, thank you for listening to me lay out some of these aspects of Lincoln and democracy, and I believe now would be an opportune moment to open the floor for questions. So I will let our referee bring us to question time.
So I have a couple questions just to get the
All right.
let some stuff come in here. You made a comment early on Democracy is consent. Okay. And then you said, if you do not want to be a slave, don't be a master. Now, is that a point being made of self-control and being decent to the common man, or was there a greater point that I missed there?
Hmm. I'd actually up the ante on that. That it's not simply being decent, because you can be decent to someone whom you hold in submission to yourself. Yeah, decent, I might say decent in quotes. You have to be more than that. You have to let them alone. And in political life and human history, that has been one of the most difficult achievements for humanity. And that is just to let other people alone, to mind your own business. A democracy, as Lincoln conceived it, a democracy is a place where people they do mind their own business. They look out for their own affairs. And the place that government legitimately has a function is that, and he in fact described this in a memorandum he wrote to himself at the beginning of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. The legitimate object of government, he said, is to do for people what they can't do or can't do nearly as well in their individual capacities. And he went on and gave a list of some examples. Taking care, for instance, of schools, taking care of education, taking care of the insane asylums, making sure that you have appropriate probate of wills. I mean, remember, he's a lawyer, so that occurs to him easily. But he said beyond those things, government doesn't really have a legitimate role to play. In other words, even government has to understand that consent is the bedrock of this American experiment, this democratic experiment. The most important thing that people can do is, apart from those things that they can't do in their individual capacity or can't do as well, the most important thing they can do is concentrate on what they themselves are doing and leave their neighbors unmolested. And of course, the problem is that is one of the great human temptations, one of the great temptations of human nature. But Lincoln would insist, no, that is part of what democratic government is about. So it's not simply the matter of being nice, of being decent. Yes, be nice, be decent. But you can't always count on people being nice or decent or sharing a definition of nice or decent. The most important thing for Lincoln is that you agree in a democracy that you're not going to try to control the lives of other people. That means you look out for what you are doing and you let other people look out for what they are doing. He's not what I would call in that respect a libertarian. He understands how important it is for someone to keep the traffic lights on. Well, he didn't have traffic lights in his day, but he'd understand the need for it today. You have to have some measure of government. But government should only limit itself to those things which people can't do just one by one, which people need to group together to accomplish. Beyond that, he's very dicey about what government ought to be responsible for doing. The essence of a genuine democracy lies in what people allow each other to do without that degree of molestation.
Thank you. We have a couple questions on election. Jeff says, are you concerned about our ability to have free and fair elections in the future?
Well, one of the difficulties about free and fair elections is it is very easy to say free and fair elections and very difficult to pull them off. People have asked me repeatedly over the last 8 to 10 years, well, do you think that this election was done fairly? Do you think that election was done fairly? Was there integrity in the election? And I have a sort of snarky response, which is to say, I don't think there has ever been an election in American history that didn't have a certain amount of irregularity in it. That, in fact, is one of the risks you run in a democracy. Elections have always, in American history, contained an element of what we could call fraud, and even in fairly recent history. In our own times, in my own lifetime, we have seen some elections where people have raised some serious questions about whether some kind of hanky-panky was going on. The funny thing is, there was even more opportunity for that in Lincoln's day. We often think that election procedures that we're familiar with in our own time are more or less the same that prevailed in Lincoln's time. Oh, no, they weren't. For one thing, there was no such thing as a registered voter in Lincoln's day, no such thing as registration lists. So there was no official list of who was entitled to vote and who was not. You showed up at the polling place on election day, and generally speaking, everybody knew who you were because this was a very decentralized society at this point. Most people knew who their neighbors were, unless you were in a major city. And if you showed up at the polling place and you weren't immediately recognized, the judge of elections would simply administer an oath. You would take the oath and then you would provide your ballot. And there was really not a whole lot more in the way of control over who could vote in a particular election. Not only that, but the ballot themselves, strictly speaking, there was no such thing as names on a ballot that you went to the polling place and pulled a lever for or filled out a form for. That didn't exist. What you did on election day was you carried a ballot with you, and a ballot would be nothing more sometimes than a list of candidates that you clipped out of your local newspaper. Because newspapers in those days were always functions of political parties. Newspapers would print the list of the names of the candidates for a variety of offices right on their editorial page. And if it was a Republican paper, it would be Republican candidates. Democratic paper would be Democratic candidates. You cut that out of the newspaper. You walk to the polling place with it. You put that in the ballot box. Or else, if you didn't cut it out of a newspaper, you showed up at the polling place and there would be a party worker with a ballot. And you took that ballot and you put it in the ballot box. Well, at that point, you're thinking, well, anybody could stuff that ballot box, and especially anybody could show up and take that oath. And the answer is yeah, and they did too. And it's curious to see that Abraham Lincoln himself complained about that. Complained about it, especially in the 1858 election in the race he ran against Stephen A. Douglas. Stephen A. Douglas had earned the endorsement, the unofficial but still potent endorsement of the Illinois Central Railroad. And Lincoln wrote a letter accusing Douglas and the Democratic Party and the Illinois Central Railroad of being in collusion to send Irish workmen, because the work crews were usually immigrant workers, sending what he called some Celtic gentlemen with carpetbags up and down the Illinois Central Railroad on election day, stopping at depot after depot along the Illinois Central, getting off the train, going to a polling place, casting a vote, taking that oath, perfectly insincere, but taking that oath, getting back on the train, going to the next depot, casting another vote, and going from one end of the state of Illinois to the other doing that. Lincoln said, we should hire a detective to track these people down. And if you read in the newspapers for the 1860 and 1864 election, read the kind of reports that are made, read the kind of letters that get published in those papers. They're all full of accusations about ballot irregularities, especially in the big cities. So in a certain sense, election difficulties, fraud may be too strong a word to use, but let's call them, election irregularities. Believe it or not, this really has been a constant feature of the American electoral process. And it's a constant feature because in many respects, that is a risk that we run in a democracy. Now, it behooves us then, if we really do believe in free and fair elections, to make sure that our election laws are as carefully calibrated as possible to exclude those incidences of fraud, a lack of election integrity. But I have to say, frankly, you're never going to eliminate it completely. And that is, again, that is simply one of the risks that we run in a democracy. Democracy, Winston Churchill said memorably, democracy is the worst form of human government except for all the other forms of human government that have been tried. So it's got its risks, it's got its weaknesses, it's got its bruises. On the whole, you'd rather live with those weaknesses and bruises than not. So election integrity, election fraud, election irregularity, call it whatever you like. That's been with us for a long time. Doubtless it will continue to be with us, but it is one of the things that we have to expect and deal with as best we can in a democracy.
I heard you once get a question about, how worried are you that we're going to plunge into another civil war? And you answered quite similarly, where you comfort, that it's all in the playbook. And I like that. I like that you're not trying to get us all riled up.
I will continue to say, when people do from time to time pose the question, are we headed for another civil war? I mean, you read this sometimes in the newspapers, especially people who are looking for clickbait when they write their articles about it. And they want to say, oh, so this percentage of the American population believes that we are headed for another civil war. And I shake my head. No, we're not. No, we're not. I mean, the conditions are simply nothing like 1861. And I have to add, too, the weapons technology is nothing like 1861 either. I'm sorry, you're not going to take a group of people with some shotguns and put them up against helicopters. I'm sorry, it doesn't work that way. It's just not going to happen. So we're not going to see any replica of 1861, and I don't think the people of the United States themselves believe that either. We are aggravated with each other. We are divided. We shake our fists. We stomp our feet, and we say no shortage of nasty things. But at the end of the day, are we really going to do what was done in 1861? And my answer is no. We wax and wane in our history through periods of intense debate and division. We wax and we wane, and we get through it. We have been doing this now for almost 250 years. And if you look at the way our colonial governments were structured, even in the colonial period, we've actually been doing it for even longer. This is not the Weimar Republic. This is not 1861. And the habits of democracy itself, I believe, are so deeply ingrained in the bones of our public life that I do not believe that civil war is more than a rhetorical talking point that people will utter when they like to think of themselves as being in some dangerous place. Practically speaking, no. Could we look at moments where there are outbreaks of violence? Yes, we can. But then again, we've been looking at outbreaks of violence in American life for a long time. We've been having a whiskey rebellion in the 1790s. We've been having Al Capone in Chicago in the 1920s. Very organized violence. And we have gotten through and past even those. So no, I'm not standing in fear of some kind of outbreak of colossal civil contest. We will get through our anxieties, even now, if we listen to what Lincoln called in his first inaugural, the better angels of our nature.
Yeah, you were consistently comforting when posed those questions, so I appreciate that. We have another light question about elections, and then a couple really good ones from Brother Frank Tomasello on democracy here. How long did election take to get results in 1864?
Surprisingly quickly. And that was largely because of the telegraph. Now, the irony is that elections considered broadly actually were very disparate. I mean, disparate in terms of the calendar. We think that all federal elections are supposed to take place on a certain day in November, because that's what we do. In our lifetime, that's how we have voted, and that's how the voting laws have existed. In fact, in Lincoln's day, yes, you elected a president and a vice president on a particular day in November, according to the Constitution, but you didn't elect members of Congress that way. Members of Congress were elected on sliding state schedules that could begin as early as September in an election year. They wouldn't run past that date in November, but they could run all through the month of October. The state of Pennsylvania, for instance, in the 1860 and the 1864 election, did its congressional voting in October. And then voting for president would occur later. So you actually went to the polls repeatedly when you were doing elections like that. Now, the good thing is that those off-schedule elections tended to serve some of the same purpose that today polling by various poll agencies, whether it's Rasmussen or Siena New York Times, those sliding calendar elections were what people seized on as indications of the drift of what a national presidential election would produce in November. But it did make the whole process of electing members of Congress a rather confusing affair, and made more confusing by the fact that Congress itself met on what we would regard as a very odd schedule. You would have, for instance, an election year, let's say the election year for 1860. And in the fall of 1860, depending on the state you were in, you would vote for a member of Congress. That member would not show up for the first congressional session until the following December of 1861. The lame duck Congress would stay in session until March of 1861, but between March of 1861 and December of 1861, Congress wouldn't be in session at all. And there were some states, the border states, for instance, which did not hold their congressional elections until May and June of 1861. So they are not just behind the usual calendar, they're months behind what we would regard today as the usual calendar for federal elections. This, by the way, is one reason why Lincoln, when the Confederacy fires on Fort Sumter, Lincoln calls for a special session of Congress to meet. It'll be a special session of the incoming 37th Congress, but he doesn't have it meet until July 4th, 1861. Why? Well, some people say, aha, this shows how nefarious Lincoln is. He's trying to govern without Congress. And the real answer is, no, he's not being nefarious at all. It's because Kentucky and Maryland haven't held their congressional elections yet for the 37th Congress. So he has to wait for the results of those elections so that he makes sure that those states are actually going to be represented when he calls that special session of Congress to meet in July of 1861. And if all this sounds very confusing about electoral schedules, it was. It really was.
That's great. Frank Tomasello asks, if Lincoln felt democracy is based on consent, how did he justify compelling the Confederate States to stay in the Union? How did he square that?
Because the Union itself was an indissoluble and indestructible union. For him, the Confederacy was an example of exactly the refusal to abide by a majority rule. The majority rule in this case was his election in November of 1860. He had been elected president with only 39% of the popular vote. Now, he had been elected with a whopping majority behind him with the Electoral College. So that sometimes when I meet people who say, oh, well, we should get rid of the Electoral College, I say, well, yeah, remember, except that the Electoral College gave us Abraham Lincoln. Nevertheless, it was Lincoln's election that caused the secession of the original 7 Confederate states. They didn't simply have a disagreement over Fort Sumter and then decide to secede. South Carolina begins the process of secession quite literally within days of Lincoln's election. And then that's followed by Georgia, by Florida, by Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, eventually Texas. What is triggering the secession of the southern states? It is a refusal to abide by majority rule. And Lincoln says this is not only a violation of the Constitution and the Union the Constitution has established, but it's also a violation of the principle of democracy itself. Democracy is not about, well, let's see what the result of this decision is, and if we don't like it, we'll take our bat and ball and go home. No, that's not how a democracy works. A democracy puts into place a majority, and a majority has the power to make the decisions. The minority, which in this case would constitute the 7 states that would plan to secede, the minority can protest, the minority can speak its mind, the minority can do whatever the laws permit it to do, but it may not rebel against that. It may not try to overthrow the majority. It may not subvert the majority. And that being the case, what Lincoln understood his responsibility as being was to enforce that democracy. Otherwise, the whole idea of the American democracy was a null set. If a democracy couldn't defend itself, if a democracy couldn't sustain its own majority rule by its own laws, then it lost all title to be a democracy. And maybe even worse than that. What it did was to say to the surrounding world, democracies don't work. I mean, remember that we create a democratic republic in 1776. And at that moment in the 18th century, it looked like this was the wave of the future. The French, of course, in 1789, start off on the same process themselves. The problem is that in the French example, it corkscrews down into the reign of terror and then into the tyranny of Bonaparte. And by the time we get to Lincoln's heyday in political life, the United States is really the only large-scale functioning democracy in the world. If the American democracy can't work, if when it encounters a disagreement like slavery, if when it encounters that, it just falls to pieces, then what that says to every king and autocrat in the world is, relax, relax. There's no threat from democracy. Democracy is always self-destruct. Democracies are always suicide pacts. Lincoln understood that what he had to do was the preservation of the democratic idea itself and the preservation of the Constitution and the laws. The Constitution contains no provision for secession. There's no reversion clause in the Constitution that tells you what to do with federal property if everybody wants to break it up. In fact, in his first inaugural, Lincoln said, this simply defies common sense. Even if you construe the Union as a partnership, whoever broke up a partnership unilaterally, you can't do that even in a business environment. So that being the case, and he as president having an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, had to understand that what the Confederates were doing was not really secession at all. It was rebellion. And it was rebellion of such a nature that, like Washington dealing with the Whiskey Rebels, like Andrew Jackson dealing with the nullifiers in South Carolina, it was his responsibility as president to call out the force of the government to suppress that rebellion. That's why there's no declaration of war between the Union and the Confederacy. I mean, the Confederacy tries to adopt one, but the Union never does. Why? Because a war only takes place between two sovereign, belligerent nations. And Lincoln's understanding was the Confederacy is not a sovereign, belligerent nation. It's a rebellion. It's an insurrection. In fact, that's why he'll studiously avoid using the terms Confederate States of America. He wouldn't even use the terminology that might seem to give some kind of shadow of respectability to their claims. So this is why he moves as he does. He moves because he is suppressing a rebellion. And that rebellion is what he has as a responsibility as the executive, as the President of the United States, to suppress, just as Washington did, just as Andrew Jackson was ready to do in 1832.
That's great. I've heard it described before that democracies are nothing but mob rule. And I was just curious, if back then, were there dissenting opinions, even in the South, about democracy in general?
Oh, goodness sakes, yes. If you wanted to listen to people complain about democracy, listen to the people in the Confederate States. Look at how they enfranchised voters or disenfranchised them. Look at the voting participation statistics. Voting participation statistics in the Confederate States in the 1850s, and the presidential elections, let's say, of 1850, 1852, of 1856, the percentage of the eligible population that actually votes in those elections is usually less than half of what you find in the northern states. Why? So you pose this question, and the answer that comes to you right away is because in the old southern states, there was such a contempt for democracy. Listen to the writings, for instance, of someone like Edmund Ruffin, the Southerner who demanded secession the most loudly, and who was the first to pull the lanyard on a gun aimed at Fort Sumter. Ruffin will say nothing but contempt for the legislature of his home state, Virginia. Legislatures are folly. People don't know what they're doing. Even look at the state of South Carolina. When the state of South Carolina cast votes for the President of the United States, straight up through 1860, the electoral votes that South Carolina cast were not calculated on the basis of what the popular vote in the state was. The electoral votes of South Carolina were cast by a decision made by the South Carolina legislature. They didn't even bother to ask what a popular vote in South Carolina was. The electoral votes of South Carolina came entirely from the legislature and legislative decision. These are people who rule by oligarchy. And it's something that James Madison anticipated long before, when Madison looked at the prevalence of slavery in the southern states. Slavery, Madison said, is always going to lead people to rule by oligarchy. It is a contradiction in terms to the notion of a democratic republic. So yes, people did complain. Even, I have to say, in the Federalist Papers, even Madison himself was a little bit less enthusiastic about democracy, considered just as democracy. But if you really want to see places where people are making fun of democracy, of claiming that it doesn't work, look to the old states of the Confederacy. That's where that kind of opinion was rife, over and over again in their publications, in their newspapers, and their private papers. For them, democracy was something loony, and you can understand why, because what was the model of their economic life? Slavery. They didn't take the consent of the slaves into any kind of calculation. Why then would they contradict that when they were making political decisions among themselves? No, they were not interested in consent from the slaves, and they were not, in fact, all that interested in consent from the broad population. It was an oligarchy of slave owners. And that was what typified life in the southern states. That's what it had become before the Civil War. And that is the attitude they take into secession, an attitude which is hostile to democracy. I'll give you one more example this way. William Howard Russell, famous British journalist, tours the Confederacy right at the outbreak of the Civil War. He's just a couple of days late getting to Charleston for the bombardment of Fort Sumter. And what amazed him was to listen to Southerners talk. We would hope, he heard people say, we would hope that you would send us some member of the British royal family to rule over us. And Russell's eyes sort of rolled back into his head. He said, we always thought we knew what we were talking about when we talked about Americans. But among these Southerners, I'm finding something entirely different. And while I cannot take one observer, Russell, and extrapolate it across the entire South, nevertheless, I think that William Howard Russell was on to something about how far Southern political life had strayed in its understanding of a democratic republic from what it should have been, and certainly from what it was in Lincoln's mind.
Do you have time for 3 more questions? I don't know what
Sure.
your clock's
No,
like.
let's go ahead.
Okay.
Let's go ahead.
Okay. Lincoln's restraint. I feel like you're one of the few people qualified to take a hip shot at this question here, but was his idealism so great that it came easier to him, restraint? Or was it was it that it took incredible self-control on his part because he just understood the principle. In other words, I guess did restraint come easy to him? That's probably to distill it down.
Lincoln often struck people who met him for the first time as being something of an oddity. And he kind of looked that way too. I mean, he's 6 feet 4 inches, but his 6 feet 4 inches is all looks like it was put together by someone that didn't know what they were doing, or even worse, maybe by a committee. He was tall, he was gangly, he was awkward, and let's face it, he was ugly, or at least homely. I mean, we're used to images of Lincoln from the Lincoln Memorial, from the $5 bill, but people who met him for the first time just thought, where did they get this guy? He just looks funny. And he was conscious of it too. He made jokes about his own appearance. That led people to underestimate this man. I mean, not only did he look strange, but he spoke with a very thick border state accent. And that led a lot of people, especially snooty Northeasterners, to think that Lincoln was just some absurd example of the backwoods and not to be taken seriously. One man who practiced law with Lincoln in Illinois, Leonard Swett, saw this happen and he said, what a big mistake. Anybody, he said, who took Abe Lincoln for a simple-minded man would soon wake up with his back in a ditch. Lincoln let people underestimate him. And then when they underestimated him, they made mistakes, and he was happy to let them live with the consequences of their mistakes. He was actually a man of surprisingly wide reading, a man who thought. William Herndon, his law partner, said that Lincoln lived in his thinking. He was a man almost abstract in the penetration and depth of his thinking. So my answer to the question is, yes, it was a matter of ideals to him because ideas themselves were important to him. He said at one point late in the 1850s, he said that moral principle is all that guides us. So here is a man who did not like to reduce politics merely to the possible or the pragmatic. He believed that it had to follow along the line of principle. And for him, the ultimate principle that it followed was the Declaration of Independence. For him, the Declaration and its announcement that all men are created equal ascended to a level of almost biblical authority. And this meant that Lincoln was willing, as much as he could, to maneuver with people, but never to maneuver in such a way that he gave up principle. So it was for him overwhelmingly the idea of this American democracy that guides him. And he's willing to make sacrifices and sometimes mistakes in the defense of that idea. He is, in that respect, as George Anastopoulos once wrote, our most constitutional president, because always in front of him were the ideas of the American founding, the ideas of Jefferson, the ideas of the Declaration. This is over and over again. He said, in fact, in Philadelphia, no less, at Independence Hall, when he was en route to his inauguration, he said to the crowd that gathered there, he was there for raising the flag outside Independence Hall on Washington's birthday. He said, I have never had an idea politically that did not originate with the ideas that were debated in this hall. For him, the Declaration of Independence was the bedrock on which the American experiment was founded and from which he derived all of his ideas. And of course, at Gettysburg, when he wants to sum up what is at stake in the Civil War, it's that proposition in the Declaration of Independence. So for him, it really is a matter of ideas. It really is a matter of principle. People sometimes talk about Lincoln as being a pragmatist, and that they will say, well, he was willing to make concessions. He was willing to swap horses. Well, yes, he was willing to do that, but never in the pure sense of pragmatism. In the pure sense of pragmatism, a pragmatist is a person who only cares for consequences, not for principles. For Lincoln, it was exactly the opposite. For Lincoln, principles were everything. Consequences were what you had to live with as a result of your principles. Principles and ideas. Yes, those were the guiding stars for Lincoln.
Thank you very much. Tom, I want you to jump in here because it's better that you ask the question because I had some.
One of the
There you
questions
go.
I have, and I should know this, but what was it divided in Congress when Lincoln took office between Democrats and Republicans? I should know that. Do you get off the top of your head? I'm assuming.
Well, the majority of the 37th Congress is a Republican majority. It's a significant majority, but it's a majority largely
Okay.
because the Southern representatives, senators and representatives, had withdrawn themselves from those states that announced their secession from November until March of 1861. The representatives and the senators all stood up, gave long-winded speeches, like Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, bidding their farewell to Congress and basically removing themselves from the halls of Congress. That left Lincoln in an unusual position. It left him with a House of Representatives, and it left him with a Senate with lopsided Republican majorities. Now, there were still Democratic minorities in both houses, but numerically, they had lost their Southern allies. These were all Northern Democrats. Now,
If the
they had
Southerners
lost
had,
the Southern half of their party. And what's more, they had lost the most important leader of their party, Stephen A. Douglas. The one person who could have rallied them in resistance politically to Lincoln in Congress, Douglas, dies in June of 1861. And it takes another 2 years for Democrats in Congress to develop any kind of effective replacement for Douglas. Even when in the off-year elections of November of 1862, or actually October and November of 1862, even in those off-year elections, when Democrats gain something like 32 to 35 seats in the House of Representatives, that's still not enough to give them a majority because so much of the Democratic Party was the Southern Democrats, and they were just gone.
if the Southern delegates had stayed, would Lincoln have had a majority?
If the Southern states had, in fact, remained in the Union, he would probably have had a very narrow, bare majority
Okay.
in Congress. And it might have been the kind of majority that really cannot get a whole lot done. And depending on how some of these elections might have panned out, he might not have had a majority in the House of Representatives. The Democrats might have had a slight majority.
It would
Either
have been
way, it
hard.
would have meant it would have meant that he would have had a very difficult time
Yeah, he would have been able
getting
to do
any
anything.
kind of policies through Congress. So you might say that by seceding, by seceding and withdrawing Democratic representatives from Congress, the Confederacy actually made Lincoln's political job easier.
The other question I had was about the concept of republicanism
Yes,
and how that, I think today we almost view that as the same as democracy, but I understand originally it's not. It's a different
right.
concept. But
Yeah.
in this time here, I think it's gone together. But a lot of people express the idea that they're fighting the war to save the Republican experiment. Not maybe you'd use the term democracy, but they reuse the term Republican, and they were worried because the historical model is that no Republic can last because it breaks up because of you were talking about something like that.
Well, I'm often confronted with the question, well, isn't the United States a republic rather than a democracy? And in the strictest use of political vocabulary, that's true. We are a republic, and we're a republic for one basic, overwhelming reason. I mean, a number of other reasons, but this is the most important one, and that is that we govern ourselves through representatives. In a democracy is governed by everybody having a say simultaneously. So that, for instance, Athens in the golden age of Pericles, Athens is quite literally a democracy. because all of the citizens, some 6,000 or so, all of the citizens participate in the city assembly. All of them have a say. Everyone can make a speech, and votes are taken of everyone, which you can do when you've only got 6,000 people to take account of. And even then, it can be a little dicey. When you have in the United States, as we do when we declared our independence, something like 2 million people, that's where we were in approximately in 1776. When you've got 2.5 million people, and especially spread out over the kind of geography that we occupied, not concentrated in one small place in Greece, then the idea of democracy in the strict term really becomes unworkable. So what do? You create a republic. And a republic is where the people spread out across the country and in great numbers elect representatives to come to a central place and do the governing. The additional attraction of a republic is that the people that you will elect will usually be people of qualifications. There will be a reason for electing one person rather than another, and the reason for doing it will be on the basis of qualifications. And those qualifications will make them superior reasoners, at least in theory. So republics tend to function in that fashion. But having made that distinction, now let me erase it, because republics exist on a spectrum. And the spectrum can run from almost outright democracy all the way to an oligarchy, such as you might find in the republic city-states of Renaissance Italy. So what you want to see in the American experiment is, yes, a republic, but it is a surprisingly democratic republic because of the degree of individual and public participation that takes place. So perhaps the best way to think about it in this respect is to think of republic as the noun and democratic as the adjective that describes it. We are a democratic republic, and a very democratic republic, as republics have gone. In that way, what we do is we satisfy a number of the demands of democracy, but we do it within a republican framework. And while sometimes this sounds like I'm moving around the shells of definitions of words, they do mean something in real terms. We are a republic, but a very democratic one, and the marker of that is most easily seen how very early on, really in the 1780s, people are already starting to use the word democracy and democratic about American government. And by the time you move into the early 1800s, the terms are being used almost interchangeably. And that's because we participate in aspects of both a democracy and a republic. So Lincoln will use the word democracy. And when he talks about a republic, he will say in his first inaugural address that this democratic republic, this constitutional republic, he'll use those adjectives to define the kind of republic that we are. So it is legitimate, given our history, it is legitimate for us to talk of ourselves as a republic and as a democracy, because we blend aspects of both. We are, if I want to be very specific about it, a democratic republic.
Thank you very much. We'll put a capstone on this, but we'll keep it light. This is the Grand Army of the Republic Library in Philadelphia. And is it true that your grandmother attended lectures held by the GAR? Is that true?
Well, sort of. And the story runs like this. My grandmother was born in 1902 in North Philadelphia on Indiana Avenue, 26th in Indiana. And she went to school at the George Clymer School, which, as I understand, no longer actually exists, but was a very popular school there in North Philadelphia. She went to the George Clymer School. She could still, decades later, sing the George Clymer School song. to her school would come on Decoration Day, as they called it then. Today, that's Memorial Day for us. But on Decoration Day, Union veterans, members of the GAR, would come to her school in their little blue caps and blue jackets, and they would talk to the school children, including my grandmother, about what the war was really about. And they talked to her in terms of the ending of slavery, of emancipation, of Lincoln. And they made it very clear that the war was not what those damn Johnny Rebs are telling you it was about. Nothing of the lost cause there. I heard these stories at my grandmother's knee growing, in fact, quite literally at her knee, growing up. And it imparted to me what I will cheerfully admit to being a Yankee view of the American Civil War by a Yankee from Yankee land, because she had imbibed that herself. In that respect, she had drunk at the well as a schoolgirl of the Grand Army of the Republic. She knew the old songs, the Union songs, not the Confederate ones. It was the Union songs she knew and taught to me. And it was the Union understanding of that great war and the GAR's understanding of that great war that I learned. So from the GAR to my grandmother at the George Clymer School, and then to me many years later, you can trace a direct line.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much for that. Now you have a website. It's a comprehensive website. You can go and you can watch quite a bit of videos or get links to them. I highly recommend it. Can you share with us the website?
Sure. That's simply www.allenguelzo, one word, allenguelzo.com.
Okay. And the book, you had a book come out last year?
I had
Earlier this
two
year.
books come out this year. One in February, Our Ancient Faith, Lincoln, Democracy, and the American Experiment, where you can find a number of these ideas that I've talked about today. But also in May, Voices from Gettysburg, Letters, Papers, and Memoirs from the Civil War's Greatest Battle. This is an anthology of primary writings about the Battle of Gettysburg, in fact, really about the entire campaign of Gettysburg, from those who participated in it. Some of it is archival material that's never been printed or published or discussed before. Some of it is what we might even call fairly well-known material, memoirs of some of the participants, like James Longstreet, for instance. But apart from short introductions to each part of the book that I wrote, it's entirely the story of Gettysburg as taught by those who participated in it. And in some respects, it's a companion volume, you might say, to the book that I wrote in 2013, Gettysburg, The Last Invasion, which is a narrative history of the Gettysburg campaign and battle. You could very easily put the two books side by side, and one would speak to the other. But Voices from Gettysburg came out in May, and it gives you, between two very convenient covers, some of the great primary sources, some of the original voices of the Battle of Gettysburg.
I thank you very much. I just wanted to thank you for sharing your time with us, your insight. A lot of people look forward to it today. Dr. Guelzo, thank you so much for everything.
All right. Thank you. And thank you for all the work that the Grand Army of the Republic continues to do in our lives today, keeping the flame of the good old cause burning for all of us.
Well said. Huzzah.